this is like behavioral interviewing in its early stages. I think it's safe to say that in 20 years, people, young college graduates will say, "What? Mom, Dad, you didn't do testing before you went to your company?" No, they just sent out some experienced guy and he interviewed us and he really liked us and he hired us. Wow. How crazy is that? Right? I mean, yeah. So I think the process will get better. The measures will get better. The data will get better. It'll be analyzed 10 ways a Sunday, of course, gosh, all you need to do is start measuring things. The greatest management principle in the world. The things that get measured are the things that get done.
This will be great, though, because it'll give the Sunday pundit something to complain about and talk about. So I'm sure there'll be lots of politics around this as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And look, we just want to make clear that it's coming and people need to come to grips with it. One of the things that happens in this process is people get angry. We're going to talk later about that. And I believe I know that anger is essentially the font of all anger is fear. And the reason people get angry is because they're fearful, because they get blindsided by the concept of a testing sort of interview or screening process.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, when they think they've nailed the first interview, which since they think it is probably true, they probably have nailed the first interview.
Right. Okay, sure.
They get this call saying they have to take a test. And they haven't, and then they haven't been paying attention to the world of career trends, and they take the message the wrong way, and then they get either angry or scared. And
yeah, you can see it, can't you? You can see that bravado, that kind of strutting around happening. Oh yeah, you guys did good on the first interview, and then you can feel them kind of puffing out their chest, and then all of a sudden they're told, by the way, you have to go do an interview.
What?
Yeah, you have to go get screened. You have to go do a test.
Well, I've never.
Yeah, exactly. I never.
And you'll never work for this company. Thank you.
Maybe that's your problem. Yeah, look, and you mentioned they get angry or they get scared, neither of which is good. And again, both happen because this manager is not aware of this growing trend. I think it's safe to say the kernel of truth here is you are going to get tested very soon, maybe on your next interview process. If not that, then the one after that. You are going to get tested. You ought not to be blindsided. You ought to be paying attention. And we have some basic recommendations to keep you from getting skewered, either because you didn't know it was coming or because you didn't understand what they were going to be asking.
Yeah. Now let's go back. You said you think they're going to increase, but will they keep increasing, but only until behavioral interviewing reaches the tipping point?
I think that's a good point, right? I mean, the idea would be this is great, but if behavioral interviewing really takes hold, then once that takes hold, then there won't be so much of this. I don't see that as happening. I think testing, pre-employment testing, is absolutely here to stay, regardless of the behavioral interview's ultimate pandemic spread across all organizations.
Okay, so this is
20 years from now.
At first, this is kind of a Band-Aid a little bit over the lack of behavioral interviewing. But once it's in place, folks are going to find it to be so effective because these tests are accurate. They're not going to stop.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly right. I think 10 years ago they were a Band-Aid, and I think now they're really effective. And a company that uses them well and then trains their managers to deliver effective behavioral interviewing, you're going to drive false positives to next to zero. Not to say that your true positives are going to be fabulous. Depends on what your standards are and what the market is and so on. But yes, I believe that it's an important adjunct. I think it's going to happen. I think any of the big companies are going to move in that direction, and many of them already are. And it's going to help improve. It's going to improve the process of screening. Now, most people then say, "Well, okay, how will we know that?" Well, frankly, you won't know that. Good interviewing, good hiring is not immediately obvious. It's obvious in retention scores and development scores and performance scores later, but it's usually not immediately obvious. So yeah, it's absolutely here to stay. I think that one of the important points is it's different than using gut feel, or even for that matter, using the behavioral interview. And frankly, that's good. Separate from which particular test we're talking about, the fact that we're adding an analytical piece in addition to the emotional piece, that just gives us another spotlight to shine on the target, if you will, the candidate. and it makes us feel better that we're not getting a one-sided version, if you will. The more time companies spend up front on being effective in the hiring process, the less time we all spend digging out from the false positives and the mistakes we make when we hire the wrong people. One more thing. It doesn't matter here, folks, whether you're senior or junior. Tests of these types are touching virtually all layers of the organization. Most people don't realize this, but executives, particularly the quite senior ones, have been getting these kind of pre-employment tests much, much longer than the rest of us have. Primarily, think about this now, folks, it should be a no-brainer. Everybody should get this right away. Because of higher costs a number of years ago, the tests were a lot more expensive back then because they didn't have the volume, and so they had to charge more per test. But more importantly, and here's the crux of it, the dangers of false positives at high levels of an organization are catastrophic. You not only have to go through a senior person not fitting in and creating poor synergy, but then you lose the person because they're going to want to move on when they realize they're not a good fit. And then you've got to fill their position again, to say nothing of the demoralization that can happen. So at the highest levels of the organization, false positives are scarily bad, really a bad idea. And so you'd rather say no to somebody who could be good. And so that means adding more screening to make sure that the bar is set so high that only the very, very best will get through.
Yeah, well, I'd suggest that in today's competitive environment where finding skilled workers in technology and manufacturing and you name it, where there's a shortage of skilled resources, that the cost of poor hires is going up astronomically. And, that there's another reason why we're likely to see more of this in the future.
Boy, you know what? I don't know that I've ever put those two together, but you are totally right. With the tightening of the job market, the cost of a false positive is rising. You almost want to set up a metric, right? Like the Dow Jones or whatever, which is the cost of a false positive based on various factors. I think you're totally right. And screening is a way to reduce potential false positives. So great point. Good. I agree. We even see this though at junior level. We see now that junior level folks, most of us, are getting skill testing way more than we did before, and also more psychological or fit testing as well. I think the fit testing is really sometimes broadly called cultural testing, meaning are you fit for our culture? Some people previously had psychological or even psychiatric tests. But even now, they're also adding skill tests to those folks as well. Basically, across the board, the use of pre-employment tests is not only happening more broadly, but it's also happening more deeply, meaning that if you had one test before, it's likely that you may get two at some point in the future.
Yeah, well, maybe your next interview won't have one, but if you ride off the trend now based on that, you're going to be caught flat-footed next time, and that's what we hope to prevent on this podcast.
Well said. I agree. Totally.
Good. Okay. So 2, they're becoming more accurate.
Yeah, indeed they are. I see some of the results, and I have to tell you, very, very hard to argue with some of the stuff I'm seeing. They're becoming more accurate, and perhaps even more importantly than that, HR and hiring managers believe they're becoming more accurate. And I think that whole belief piece is really, really important.
Yeah. Again, that adds to the growing prevalence here.
Yep, exactly. Yep.
But I think our point here was that if someone were to think that they could either game them or ignore them or talk their way around them, they are hugely mistaken.
Yep, you're right.
This may not be a standard everywhere, but where pre-employment tests are used, they're considered a good indicator of fit or skills. In much the same way that many of our members are quite surprised by the insights of DISC, we hear that all the time.
Yeah.
Other tests may surprise folks the same way. I mean,
right.
There's plenty of science underlying these tests. And frankly, when you look at it, they're pretty compelling.
Yeah, I could easily spend days just digging through the underlying metrics, the algorithms and so on. And, you take 10, 15, 20,000 people through this process and you see the screening process being proven out again and again and again. And you say, well, somebody put some time and effort into really making this process, the screening process, an effective one. So I think you're absolutely right. And you're right. DISC is one of the screening tests that firms use.
Believe it or not. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But okay, so number 3, they look at skills and fit generally.
Yeah, I think we've already really kind of beat this horse a little bit. We just want to be clear about what most tests are and are not. Companies use pre-employment tests generally to validate, keyword, validate that a candidate either has the right skill fit or that their behavioral, emotional, interpersonal temperament, if you will, is a good fit for the culture of the hiring firm. While you can, if you're doing it well, you can get that kind of fit and skill analysis from enough interviews, many firms either don't have clear standards for assessing this, or they simply, even if they do have clear standards, they don't expect people to meet them, if you will. For cultural or interpersonal fit, a lot of firms generally rely on the feel that interviewers report. I like this guy. She's just, I don't know what it is about her, but I'm just not real sure. I mean, hiring is important, and we're basing it on some senior person saying, I'm just not real sure. Imagine going to the board of directors of your company and saying, I really think this is a good idea, but I'm not real sure.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, really, it's like interviewing is the last frontier where somehow we think our gut is a business tool, and it's not.
And we've got plenty of evidence to suggest that it's a terrible tool.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
It doesn't work.
It's not just a tool; it's a terrible tool, right? I think also some of these tests work really well in the case where the fit is not as natural to see. This is particularly true among people who are introverted, because often the interviewer is extroverted, and so that's a very difficult interviewing process to make successful. But basically, those fits that are harder to see, if you have a test that'll show you, a screen that'll show you, hey, this is really actually a really valid fit. Maybe it makes you take them through an extra interview, but that interview essentially revalidates what you've learned from the test and what perhaps has been talked about in the previous interviews. Nothing wrong with spending an extra hour or two validating that somebody's the right person for the job.
Yeah, and this won't be a surprise to a lot of folks in the technical arena. This has been happening kind of at an individual contributor level for a while, but it's very possible, given the trends, that managers in either technical or in an industrial skills area will be tested as well.
Yeah. Oh, totally. Yeah. I wouldn't be a bit surprised if in a few years companies come up with what amounts to 50% analytical, 50% emotional kind of screening processes. I think you're absolutely right. And it takes many forms as well. Sometimes candidates are asked to answer a series of questions in writing, or they're supposed to tackle a coding or some other technical challenge in front of observers, if you will. Or sometimes they're even asked to draw up the basics of a marketing plan or a communication plan. You don't need to worry that you're going to be tested on something that doesn't make sense for you, or that you're going to be tested on future jobs. That's not usually an issue, or on unrelated skills. It's not as if the test itself is a big black hole of uncertainty. And I think it's safe to say the basics of them are easy to get ready for. And for the candidate who's prepared, for the manager, for the effective manager, for the manager tools manager who's prepared, an employment test, a pre-employment test is nothing to worry about.